Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I'm joined by Hugo and I'm Josh, and just a little bit of an announcement. We are moving forward. We are going to make Contemplations a lot longer and just have it on the Saturday as one standalone episode, and it's going to be much deeper and we're going to go in much more detail into things. And on the Sunday, instead, we're going to have Epochs, which is the history podcast, which is also going to be a similar sort of format. So today, we're going to be talking about egalitarianism and whether it is good or bad.
Yeah. So last week we talked about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, and we looked at those two, and what we focused on primarily was practicality. So looking at those two and saying, okay, is there merit in any of those? What do they actually mean? Can you have any of them? Is it something that is practical? Is it something that is achievable? And so today I want to kind of move on a little bit to questions more about morality, about what is right or not. So talking about whether equality or egalitarianism is a desirable goal, right? So that's going to be the focus of it.
Yeah,
so,
and just to recap, what I kind of took away from the last one is that I've been using equality of opportunity in a way which I actually, when I found out about the definition, I was quite unhappy with, because I kind of wanted it to be equality before the law and pretty much nothing else. And equality of opportunity means that it's like a levelling out, isn't it, of people's opportunities, which kind of sounds a bit Marxist to me, and therefore I don't want to use that term anymore. But
yeah, and so this is just a summary, right? So we've had a long discussion about that, and so if you want to see that, go to last week's Contemplations and you can see our whole discussion about that there, because this is just a summary. Even to people to whom this might sound bad, it's equality of opportunity sounds like communism or something like that's a simplification, of course. So it's worth checking that out. And so just to start off, I want to read one quote from a socialist who's talking about equality and egalitarianism, and who kind of he describes very well what the discussion about that is today in politics and political discourse. So it's by Ed Brooksby. In fact, it's hard today to find anyone who is really against equality. The political dispute in relation to equality is not between egalitarians and anti-egalitarians. It's a struggle over the definition of the principle of equality, what is to be equalized, between whom equality should be obtained, and where the limits should be drawn. Commitments to the notion of equality is deeply embedded in the fabric of modern politics. Right? And so this is the characterization from a socialist, from someone who is an egalitarian in kind of sense. I mean, I think it's fair to say he can't defend himself, he's passed away, but this is what it's like. And I kind of agree, this is how the discussion usually goes. It's about what type of equality is good, and not about whether egalitarianism as such is something that is legit or not, right?
if it's feasible or viable, practical, or even desirable.
Yeah. And if something, it's always about practicality, right? That's the thing. It's always about whether you can actually achieve something or not. It's not about whether it's right or not. Everyone kind of agrees, or tacitly agrees, that yes, equality is something to strive towards, and maybe it's not always the best, but it's usually something that is better than the alternative, unless otherwise proven, right? And so this state of affairs, I would say, is very much a huge achievement of one part of the political spectrum, of kind of steering the discussion and making it in their image, right? And so it's something that is remarkable. I mean, I find it fascinating that this is what you can do with your political movement, that you can kind of shape that whole discussion so that it is like that, so that your view or your basic idea of what is good and what is not is so ingrained that everyone kind of agrees on it, and then your opposition also agrees, and you only bicker about the details of what is the best thing to implement that, or the best version of it, right?
I think that the term people use is the Overton Window, which I started hearing very suddenly all the time, and I kind of don't like using it for that reason, just because I never heard it before. But it seems like the conversation about egalitarianism is very much shifted towards the left, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that pretty much everything is framed from that perspective, and is not really much in the way of framing from the right-hand side of the political spectrum, if you want to break it down that way.
Yeah, and usually the approach of the right or the any opponents of the left, when in a discussion, how it usually goes is the left says, okay, equality is good, this specific form of equality is good, and the opponents say, okay, but you can't, like, that's not realistic. You have to accommodate for these and these facts. You have to count all of that in, because otherwise you're going to end up in the wrong place. You don't want any of that, and so it's something that is like that, right? The discussion is not about, okay, one side would say, I want equality of this and that. That is good, and that is what we should strive towards. And the other one would say, no, that's evil. Just go away, right? That's not how it goes. And so, if egalitarianism is not usually challenged in the political debate like that, and the question of why is not usually asked, then that's what we're going to do now, because that's interesting if it's not usually discussed like that, right?
Absolutely.
So this is how I wanted to approach that, just because the discussion is usually just boring about means and about practicality, and that's not what I want to talk about. And so let's start with what is egalitarianism. There is a lot of different kind of divisions within that phrase and kind of hidden meanings. And so I'm going to go over a few kind of fault lines where you can divide different kinds of egalitarianism and different kinds of egalitarians. And hopefully at the end at the end of this section, we'll be able to understand a little bit what the range is and what we can take as representative of the movement or the ideology. Right?
I take it there are lots of competing definitions, as with many political terms,
Yeah.
where each kind of interpretation is conflicting with one another in some small ways, but the general rule is going to be more or less the same.
Yeah. And so, actually, on Wikipedia, first thing you pull up, there is a good distinction, a good definition that contains the distinction, and I found that really useful, so I'm going to quote that. The term egalitarianism has two distinct definitions in modern English, either as a political doctrine that all people should be treated as equals and have the same political, economic, and social and civil rights, or as a social philosophy advocating the removal of economic inequalities among people, economic egalitarianism, or the decentralization of power. Some sources define egalitarianism as equality reflecting the natural state of humanity. And so that definition of what it can actually mean, what it usually means when people talk about it, is quite important, because it contrasts two approaches to equality and to egalitarianism that you can have. You can either take it from the vantage point of the ideal of state-citizen relations, relations between citizens and the state, or from the point of view of fighting of economic inequalities, or inequalities that go deeper into society beyond the relation between the state and the citizen.
Yeah, and I think you would see the latter one, the one that looks at inequalities as being the more typically socialist or left-wing or progressive, whatever you want to call it. That's more that side of the debate, and the one where it's just about the relationship between the individual and the state, that's typically been the more conservative position, hasn't it? Or at least in modernity, it seems like it's kind of an interpretation where it's maybe equality before the law or something along those lines.
I agree that this distinction kind of mirrors the ideological divide between proponents of equality and also proponents of equality, but lesser ones. And so this is so when we look at the first kind of the state citizen thing, why that is kind of interesting and why it's relevant that it can mean something like that is that, okay, if this is a massive simplification, but let's say that you have a state and the state goes through like a period where, you have all these human rights laws and people and civil rights kind of movements. So let's say the US in the 60s, and everything you have codified into law, into constitutional law, that the state cannot discriminate based on these kind of personal arbitrary characteristics and things like that. You have other things as well, but this is kind of one of those things. And so if you've gone as a state through something like that, then you can say, okay, well, now the state kind of approaches everyone the same, or at least it says it will, because that's the legal way of what it's supposed to do, what it says it's going to do. So if the state now approaches everyone the same and doesn't make any distinction between these, according to these arbitrary characteristics, well, then egalitarianism has reached its goal, and now we can move on to something else, right? And so I know that this is a simplification. Of course, the state says that it's going to do something and then it does something else. Just the fact that there is a constitutional amendment doesn't mean that that's what actually happens when people go to bureaus and talk to bureaucrats and figure out or have actual relations between themselves and the state. And so it is a simplification, but like as an overview, you can say, okay, if you've gone through something like that and you've made sure that the state approaches everyone the same, or at least that's the kind of aim, and everyone is aiming towards that, well, then that's that solved, and now we can go on to talk about like deforestation or whatever, right? And
so that's like a theoretical example of what that was it the former approach, where it's the equality between, or the what was it again? Egalitarianism, sorry, between the state and the individual.
Yeah. So from that approach, so focusing on the aspect of the state where it approaches everyone equally. So when the state has relations with its citizens, whether they are kind of bureaucratic or monetary or regulatory or things like that, then it doesn't matter who that is.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make a difference based on arbitrary characteristics, but only based on characteristics that are pertinent to whatever the state kind of is doing, right? And so that is the one meaning of egalitarianism that is often used. And so, okay, what I said in kind of the simplified process of the state being reorganized this way, okay, now I'm going to approach everyone equally. Well, if that's solved, then egalitarianism is not that ambitious, right? It's something that it's not that useful, because okay, now we've solved that problem, we can move on, and now it has no other place in society, right? And that's not how it usually is, because at least in the West, I don't know about any state who would not take this approach of having it codified in law that the state is going to approach everyone the same regardless of arbitrary characteristics, right?
Absolutely,
that's standard. And like, I'm not saying it's bad or anything like that. I mean, it's just saying like this is what it is. This is what it has already been achieved. And so if your idea of egalitarianism is this, you're just going to say, okay, case closed, let's go home, right? And so the other one is more interesting, because because the former has been already achieved in all those Western states, what is being fought for is something else, because you can't fight for something that's already been achieved. You can. You look stupid if you do. So the second one goes beyond the state to kind of social relations and economic relations between people. And that's interesting. That's important. The distinction. It's between people and not between a person and the state, right? And so it's a different focus. It's not so much on politics, but on society. And that is very much a more useful approach for people who want to advocate for that and want to make that maybe careers out of it and want to be really interested in it, because inequality always exists and always going to exist, and that's one of the facts of life, and we're going to talk more about that later as well. But if it always exists, if it's something that's always going to be here, the fight never stops. There's always something to fight for, and you're never going to achieve the ultimate goal of what you want. So it's something that is that has kind of good perspectives. It's just like if you want to fight for equality, well, if you take this definition, well, your fight is going to be
Forever,
never
yeah.
ending, and that might be good for you, because if you're interested in it, if you want to spend your kind of a lot of effort on it, well then,
it would certainly benefit the political class, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
In that, if you define egalitarianism in that manner, then it's clearly going to say, well, we still haven't achieved our goals, this is why you need to vote for us, and then the goals will always be shifting, even if they're managing to achieve what they set out beforehand. They can always just say, well, there's like a 0.5% difference between, I don't know, men and women in the workplace. This is awful, this is an absolute horrific thing, therefore we need to make it 0.
And this is actually something that I have a couple of good quotes later on. So this is going to be fun. But this is, as I said, this is if you want to fight for something like that, you might not want to actually achieve what you want, because then you have to find something else to do. So it might be better for you to actually never achieve what you say you're aiming to achieve, because what you're going to do afterwards, right? It's the ultimate curse of achievement, right?
I remember loads of gay rights activists around the time that gay marriage was legalized in the UK. They were just like, "What are we going to do with ourselves? I mean, we've made a career out of this," and all of a sudden, all of these new issues just appeared out of nowhere, almost like it was just to benefit their own career. It's funny that.
Yeah, you have, oftentimes you have, if it takes a long time, you have whole industries kind of springing up, organizations being set up, and this all kind of grows and prospers as long as that goal is not achieved. But when it's achieved, like, they have to repurpose themselves, and that's a fact of life. Like, it's not just with this thing, but it applies to the thing as well. I mean, you could say, okay, that's what happened with NATO after the end of the Cold War, right? That's a massive detour. But you had the Cold War, of course, and you had NATO, and you had the US building up huge military capacities because it was justified by the USSR, and the USSR being the great enemy. And then when the USSR fell, they needed to find new ways to justify that, because obviously you're not going to stop that. You don't want to stop that. It's good business. And so you invent new things like narco-terrorism, and like these boogeymen, and like, or just petty dictators in small irrelevant countries somewhere, because
Libya.
Iraq was the first one in 1990,
of course,
right?
Yeah,
So you invent things like that to kind of keep going, and it's kind of a sad state of affairs, especially when it's transparent, and then you look very sad.
Yeah, I get the point you're making, that when something has been achieved, it quite often gets redefined, and I think we're probably going a little bit off of the egalitarianism route, but it is something that is present in other areas as well, and I think that adds validity to that interpretation when it actually comes to egalitarianism, because it does seem to be the case that when you have these almost impossible goals in mind, that you're always going to be redefining what egalitarianism is.
So this is why I would say the latter version of it is dominant among the people who actually say that they are egalitarians and fight for equality, right? The latter one, the social, interrelational one, not the one that pertains to the state and the citizen, the relation between those, just because that one has limited opportunities for you to what you can actually do. And especially now when most states, or all states in the West, have basically codified that into law. So what you're going to do next? You're going to make sure that it's enforced properly, sure, but that's not as exciting, is it?
Yeah.
And so
I would like to take a moment to say that although they have codified it into law, it doesn't mean it's necessarily enforced. And you did make that point earlier, but I would like to emphasize it, that I imagine there will be people who would be saying, well, actually not everyone's equal before the law, and I would agree. But it's there in theory at the very least, and it's presented as if that is the case, even though it may not be.
And so the other thing is, just to make the picture kind of more complete, is that what I was talking about is that you have these approaches the equality before the law codified in constitutions, right? That's where it usually is. And then on top of that, you can have other laws that are not necessarily compatible with that. You can have other laws that contradict that. But that happens quite often because you have millions of laws. You can't make it so that every one of them is compatible with every other. So what you end up with is kind of laws, regular laws that are used in everyday kind of life that might go against that. That might codify some kind of inequality of how the state approaches its citizens. But what I was talking about is that kind of constitutional arrangement that says, okay, this is what it should be and this is what it's striving towards, even though in reality it might be something else on the ground. In the past couple of years, or maybe decades by now, you've had these kind of different approaches, mainly stemming from the left, I would say, where you approach different groups based on different kind of characteristics that they have, and you approach them differently if you're a state, because you say, okay, because of kind of past injustices, you need to do this and that. Affirmative action is one of those things, and these things go against that kind of ideal that is usually codified in the constitutions of saying, okay, we'll approach everyone equally regardless of arbitrary characteristics, but doesn't matter. You have these things that contradict each other, and that's what happens in practice. So that's not what we mean. And of course, the people who often fight for egalitarianism or equality, they support this kind of thing because the way they see equality is different. Maybe if they see it in the latter version, in this kind of social sphere, social definition, well, if that's your goal, if that's what you're fighting for, well, that first definition might be in your way sometimes, right? So,
yeah, they are at odds with one another. Yeah. Equality before,
they don't have to be, but they can easily be.
Yeah, like equality before the law. I'm just using that as like a placeholder for that first definition. The one that I said was a bit more conservative, perhaps. Then that would be at direct odds between the one which wishes to make everyone equal, because if you want to raise everyone to the same level, then you would have to treat them all differently, and therefore it would make sense from their perspective to apply the law differently to different people, wouldn't it?
And so that was one of the definitions, one of the distinctions that I wanted to mention. Another one was that there are two classes of egalitarians based on how they approach it, what it actually means for them. You can see equality as a goal or as a means towards another goal, right? And that is a crucial difference, because I would argue that the means egalitarians are not actually egalitarians, because what they would say is, we're interested in the question of why equality would be good, or why is it a desirable goal. And they would say, okay, I want X, and egalitarianism is a way to get X, and therefore I want egalitarianism. That's the why. That's easy. And so that's not something that is very, very interesting, because we can talk about, that's about practicality still, right? Okay, this is a means towards X. Is it actually means? Is it not? Is that going to lead towards X or not? It's not a discussion about whether it's right or not and why it should be right or not. So the means egalitarians, that's not something that would be very interesting. So, for example, you have that in the debate about inequality that usually happens with in more economic spheres, let's say, right? And then you often have that kind of sense that the whole discussion is a bit of a misnomer, because they're actually talking about poverty and not about inequality, right? They're saying, okay, the world is really unequal. A lot of people have almost nothing, and a lot of people have small number of people have a lot of money, and this is a problem because those people are poor. Wait, that's the problem, right? That the people are poor, right? And so that's it. Usually comes down to that. It usually comes down to, okay, egalitarianism is a way that we argue that poverty should be reduced, right? And so for the means egalitarians, that's what it's like. That's what the discussion is, right? It's something that you use to fight for something else that you actually value.
So it's almost like a means of framing something, because in the poverty case, that they're framing it as if other people being well off means that there's some kind of deficit for these people in poverty, and it's almost like treating the economy as a zero-sum game, which obviously is something that I don't agree with. But it's just a means of kind of shoehorning in their belief in a way, in that you can frame, oh well, that there's poverty here, but the only way to solve that is through being more egalitarian, which I see as not following, but I can at least see the theoretical argument that they're trying to lay out there.
Yeah, exactly. And so for those people, equality is a means towards alleviating poverty, right? Because that's how you do it in their eyes. I don't agree, but that's how they see it, right? And so that's not really interesting, because equality is not the goal, right? And so we want the goal egalitarians. That's who we're interested about, because those people value equality in and of itself, and egalitarianism as a goal, just because it's about equality and not because of other outcomes that it might produce. And so now the question becomes, and that's, we're shifting the discussion a little bit, but the question becomes, why would egalitarianism be the default, right? So for these people, for the goal egalitarians, it's a default that equality is good. And so, okay, then you can talk about inequality and whether that's sometimes good as well or not. But equality is good by default. And so we need to ask why. Why would egalitarianism be the default? And the usual answer, I don't want to strawman anyone, so I want to borrow an argument from Rawls, which is a massively influential philosopher in the 20th century, probably the most influential and famous like in that century. And so I'm going to quote from him and take ideas from him, not to take arguments out of thin air. And so the claim that egalitarians usually make is that egalitarianism is intuitive. It's something that everyone would rationally choose if they were not kind of thinking about something else that might be clouding their judgment. And so Rawls codifies that argument in a way. He makes that argument in his famous book, A Theory of Justice, and I think a lot of people will be familiar with it because that's kind of a thought experiment that he devised. I don't think it's particularly insightful, but it was innovative in some way, and it illustrated something that you could get at through different ways, but he did it in his specific way. And so what he introduced was the veil of ignorance, which is a concept where you say, if you didn't know who you were going to become, imagine that you are not born yet, but you are conscious and you know that you're going to be born, but you don't know where and to whom you're going to be born. You don't know kind of your circumstances, you don't know anything about yourself, you don't know where you're going to pop up in society. And the question is, what kind of society would you choose? Would you want to live in? Would you want to risk in that way? Because you don't know if you're going to end up at the top of that society or at the bottom of that society. And so you would probably want to kind of have society or have designed that society that is acceptable in both cases, because you don't know if you're going to end up at the one end of the scale or at the other, right?
Yeah, I understand this quite well, but I would imagine that actually most people, when it's framed in that sense, would probably be more willing to be happy to live in a egalitarian society. But I think that's also motivated by just a psychological impulse in human beings. I know we've covered it before, but prospect theory, where your losses and risk and things that damage you are twice as psychologically motivating as potential gains. And this might motivate people to say, well, I would rather hedge my bets and be equal to everyone else in just responses to this scenario than potentially risk being worse off, because they value risks and losses more highly in the spectrum of what is possible than otherwise.
So how he deals with that is, he says risk aversion and the fact that different people have different levels of risk aversion is something that is part of that society too, or part of that unknown, right? And so you have to consider that you could be completely risk averse and you wanted to cover all your grounds, and so you want to be safe than sorry. And he says that that's why you would want to make sure that there's no real chance that you're going to end up really bad, might end up worse than others, or worse than you would have liked, but it's not going to be terrible, right? And that's his postulate. And so what he says is that, okay, if people think about this, if people imagine themselves coming to the world like that and imagining themselves behind that veil of ignorance, what they would want from that society would be something that where equality plays a huge role, because they would want something where you might end up kind of better off and well off, and that would be fine. But if you end up in the worst possible position, you still want to be kind of well enough off anyway. And so it's going to be something that is maybe not perfect equality, but still more equal than not, right? It's something where equality is very important and where equality is kind of valued because it provides that cover from that uncertainty where behind the veil of ignorance you don't know where you're going to end up. And so the derived conclusion that the summary of what Rawls presents by this is that all social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the basis of self-respect are to be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution of any or all of these values is to everyone's advantage. That's a quote from one of the websites that I'm going to link below that summarizes Rawls' views. And I found this quite nice because this is what he's getting at. He's saying there are some resources in society there, and those resources can be material, they can be social, they can be kind of psychic, right? And so all of these resources, you want them to be distributed more or less equally, because behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know where you're going to end up, and everyone would want to be ensured that they're not going to be left to die or something like that, right? And so this is the solution, or this is the conclusion that he arrives at. I don't think that that's necessarily completely valid. I see his point, of course, but at the same time you could say, well, fine, if you're talking about the veil of ignorance and that you don't know where you're going to end up, maybe you would want to pick the society where it's not the least equality, not the most equality, but the most mobility, right?
Yeah.
So even if you start off as the person that is the worst off, if there's an extreme amount of mobility, you can end up on the top, like in no time, just because you put some kind of effort into it.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's a more hierarchical thing that isn't seeking to be, egalitarian, but at the same time that it's incredibly meritocratic in that your work would probably correspond very highly to your position within society, wouldn't it? In a case where there's high social mobility.
Yeah, and so that's one answer to Rawls, to say it's not clear whether everyone who would make that thought experiment, who would do that thought experiment, they would choose equality, like an equal society. Like that's not clear. A lot of people might not choose that, might choose something else, right? Because something else might be as good of an insurance policy against bad outcomes that you don't know whether you're going to end up. Well, equality is not necessarily the only insurance policy that you can have against that, behind the veil of ignorance.
It's a good point. Yeah. And I think the actual thought experiment itself is kind of a little bit of I don't want to say sleight of hand, because it implies maliciousness, but it seems to me to be slightly misleading to the actual nature of things, because no people are actually in that scenario, and more often than not, people judge themselves relative to the situation in which they know. So say you were moderately well off in, I don't know, Africa, then as long as relative to the people around you, you would be happy with what you had, as long as you have the food and water and security, like the very base things. And if you had that same amount of wealth in, say, the UK, perhaps, because it's relative, you would be much less happy because you would probably be far lower down the social hierarchy, to bring in a kind of another concept entirely.
No, I agree. That's a valid criticism. At the same time, what he says in response to those kinds of objections is that this thought experiment will have particular results for each society, right? So each society will have some kind of a different level of what they consider fair and what they consider acceptable or not. And so it's not something that would end up the same if you did it in Congo and if you did it in the UK. Like, people are not going to answer the same thing. But the thought experiment is not something that is realistic. People don't think about that in that way. But that's why he says it's an interesting thought experiment, because it's getting at something that is important. It's important to take a look at society as a whole from the position of someone else, someone who is worse off, and someone who comes into that society being worse off than you, right? And so that's his justification of saying, okay, people usually don't imagine it like that because they only live their own lives, and kind of imagining yourself in a different situation might be difficult, might be something that people don't usually do. And so this is a method for you to do that, to kind of consider what it's like and consider whether your society is just based on the result of that thought experiment. And so another one of objections that I have to his thought experiment, besides that one about people choosing different kind of insurance policies besides equality, is that, well, okay, if you don't know, if you have this veil of ignorance and you don't know anything about where you're going to end up, what you're going to be like, what qualities you're going to have, what strengths or what weaknesses, what if you also don't know when you're going to be born, right? Then you would probably want a society that grows a lot, where over time you don't have poverty, you don't have people in destitute, because then if you don't know when you're going to be born, you might be born kind of, if you're in a society that grows fast, well, if you have a 100-year span in which you can be born in that thought experiment, and 90 years out of those 100, it's going to be much higher living standards for everyone, even for the worst off, than in another society where it's his solution, like equality, right? Well, then that kind of changes the odds a little bit, right? Of course, then it's the question of risk, but him saying that you don't know what your risk aversion is going to be like, it's not exactly something that you can do, right? Because you assume some kind of risk when doing that thought experiment.
You could also flip it a little bit and say, if it were a society where the norm is suffering and you're in abject poverty, then people would be more willing to hedge their bets and say, well, maybe I don't want equality, and actually I'll take the risk, and maybe I can turn out as one of the few people who isn't in that situation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I didn't even think about that. Like, yes, if that's the norm, and you can either have an option where there's no exceptions or where there's some exceptions, well, you obviously want the small chance that there can be an exception. It can be you here.
Yeah.
So sure. If you can discard that thinking of, okay, it can either be like everyone in destitute and few people rich, or everyone living happily and in wealth, that's kind of thinking behind it, which prevents this objection. But wealth doesn't work like that, right? It's not a zero-sum game. So it can be that you have everyone living in destitute, that's the one scenario, or you have everyone in destitute apart from 5 people, right? And
so, yeah.
like same destitute. So that's the more realistic scenario. So I agree with that example. That's a good point. And so now I'm gonna quote from an encyclopedia that describes what Rawls talks about. Rawls argues that even without formal barriers to equality, those with greater social and natural advantages, for example, intelligence and strength, will get a disproportionate percentage of social goods like income and positions. These advantages are beyond an individual's control, and thus the unequal outcomes are unjust. So that's the attacking of the equality of opportunity that is always touted by conservatives, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is saying, okay, even if you have a meritocratic society like that, that is unjust because people don't deserve that. People haven't worked for their intelligence because that they have been given that by the accident of their birth, right? And so he's saying, okay, this is clearly something that is not. If a society is ordered along those lines, is not something that's just because it's not something deserved. People have been given that, and people have been given those capacities to be able to achieve those positions, even though part of it might be their own achievement because they might have to have worked towards it, but still, other people might want to work towards it and try, but fail because they don't have these innate advantages. And so that is his point. That is the same point that is made by a lot of, basically all of egalitarians that argue for that kind of more substantial idea of equality rather than just equality before the law, as you would describe it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so saying, okay, even if you have equality before the law, like the accident of birth and you having a high IQ is not something that you deserved, and so okay, you might work and have a better life because of it, because you worked. Okay, part of that achievement is yours, part of that is not. To the extent that it's unjust. Those advantages that you have because of that.
Even within that approach, though, there are two different ways that they could look at it. They could say, well, we don't like that some people have natural advantages that they so-called don't deserve, but then they could say, well, we don't actually want to bring those people down. We want to try and focus on bringing the people at the bottom up. Whereas there's also another interpretation where they might say, okay, well, there are people who have advantages, and it is a moral imperative that these people give up some of their advantages to help the people who have less advantages. And that's two different perspectives I can see in this one kind of group of egalitarians.
And both of those perspectives are already take as granted that equality is something good to strive towards, right?
Absolutely,
that it's something desirable. And Rawls here says that inequality is unjust because it comes from these aspects of life that people have no control over. And so when it comes from those, it is unjust because it's not deserved, right? If the advantages that you have without your control, if those translate into social advantages, then that's not a just process, according to Rawls. And so what that means is, I'm going to quote again, Rawls' theory of fair equality of opportunity, that's the thing, right? So you have equality of opportunity, and then you have an outgrowth of it, a fair equality of opportunity. That's what we talked about last week, right? Is that you have that kind of basis of what people mean, of what you meant as well when you were coming to discussion, and then the opponents come and say, okay, but this equality of opportunity is not actually equality of opportunity. You need to make it something a bit different. You need to make it a fair equality of opportunity because that is actually the equality of opportunity that you're trying to aim towards, right? And so that's what I just wanted to point out, that that's what the word means here.
Yeah, and I believe I actually kind of abandoned the use of the term equality of opportunity, didn't I? In favour of just
because of that, exactly.
Yeah, because I'm more in favour of meritocratic principles and leaving people alone to do what they want rather than this.
So I'm going to start again. Rawls' theory of fair equality of opportunity requires that resources be redistributed across social classes. In order to give every individual the same opportunity to cultivate his or her abilities and pursue his or her ambitions, the state must provide additional resources, for example, bilingual education or healthcare, when individual families are unable to provide them. Right, and so that's the conclusion that you get at from the previous point, from the point where you say, okay, these are innate differences that people haven't deserved. Well, if they're undeserved, if they're unjust because they're undeserved, well, you need to mitigate that, or it's just to mitigate that, and you need to do that by the state providing these things to those people who are disadvantaged by nature like that, right? And so that's just the conclusion that grows out of that previous point. So I want to respond to that a little bit now. Let's say we grant the premise, right, that the original kind of distribution or the original outcomes are unjust because people haven't completely deserved them. Well, the question then becomes, can you do something about it without acting unjustly yourself? Because if you take the state, which is not a consensual organization by and large, which works in a way that it takes money by force from some people, some group of people, sometimes all people, and it takes them and it gives them to some other people, maybe the same people in some ways, takes a little bit for itself, gives that money out in some other ways. And so if that organization is to perform that kind of function, well, it has to act unjustly in order to achieve that just outcome, right? If we agree to the premise that the outcome would be more just, well, then you have a dilemma, right? You need to do something that is not right in order to do something that is right. Well,
so in this example, you might be suggesting that the state takes people's taxes at a disproportionate rate, as in the more money you have, the more taxes you pay by percentage.
Or any taxes, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Regardless of that, because it's doing that perhaps against your will, then that is a form of injustice in and of itself, no matter what the goal is, even if they're trying to redistribute it to poor people, or whether that's something moral or not, is another question. But
so if we have the question, can you do something about it without acting unjustly yourself? Well, yes, you can, by charity, by taking your own money, taking your own resources, and putting it to that use which makes the situation more just, right? Sure, that you can do that without acting unjustly. It's fine. But if what you do involves taking people's money or resources or status or anything that's not consensually given, well, then you are acting unjustly, and you're not taking it from people who haven't deserved it. That's the part of it, right? Because part of what, even in the Rawlsian scenario, you have achievements that people have, and people have partly deserved it and partly haven't, but you can't really quantify that. You don't know how much, like those things are very abstract, and so you know that those people haven't probably deserved all of them, or not all of it is due to their own effort. Fine, if you grant that, then you're still taking something from them against their consent or without their consent, and by doing that, and by doing that arbitrarily necessarily, because there's no way you can do it non-arbitrarily, you're doing an injustice, you're performing an injustice, and so it becomes a problem, right? It becomes a problem where you're doing something unjust in order to do something just, and I don't know.
I very much agree. Yeah, it seems
if we arrived to that point, like philosophically, that's probably like we might have taken the wrong turn somewhere, because it's kind of a position that you don't want to really end up in.
The only way I could see people kind of opposing that view is they could say, well, if you elect a party where they have a strong mandate to do something like that, although I don't necessarily agree with the argument itself, they might say that, okay, well, this party has, I don't know, a 51% majority, and therefore they represent the largest group in society, and this large group wants there to be some kind of redistribution through coercion through the state, and they might not term it in such a harsh way, but that would probably be the way that they would say, well, if democracy has returned this kind of mandate for us to do this, then that's fine. And I don't actually agree with that argument, but I imagine that would be the one that would be in opposition to this position.
They're arguing against themselves, right? In that point, because they would, the way they would, what they would usually try to do is to defend minorities against the majority, right? Defend any kind of minorities from the state or from what the majority can do. Like that's a left-wing thing, like ideologically, right? That's a left-wing goal. And so if you're arguing the opposite now, saying, not you, but them, if you're arguing the opposite now and saying, okay, this is what the majority has decided, therefore it's justified and it's just, actually, well, no, that's what you spend your career arguing against. So just this is a non-starting point.
Yeah, I do agree that that's not an argument, but I can imagine it coming up.
I agree. Like that's something that I would hear as well sometimes. Like this is, it usually comes from people who are really invested in it, but who haven't heard much opposition to it, and so they haven't been challenged in that way. You would have a lot of people who wouldn't make the argument just because that, who make a different argument for redistribution like that, because they would recognize that this is not a good argument. This is an argument that is kind of, that is a power move, right? You make it when it's useful for you, and don't make it if you have bad intentions. And if they don't have bad intentions, they wouldn't do that. And so the more thorough ones, the more honest ones, they wouldn't make this argument. So.
The funny thing is, it's surprising how often you hear an argument like that, as in, like, well, we are the party in power and we were elected, therefore we can do what we want, or I'm a supporter of this party and therefore they can do what I wanted them to do. And you do hear that, even though it is inherently wielding power in a way that is, as you said, unjust.
And so we have this premise from Rawls saying, okay, these unequal outcomes are unjust because those aspects that led to it were beyond an individual's control. They were innate, maybe, or they were outside of what you can affect. And so we postulated in this discussion a little bit that we agreed to that premise. But of course, you can say, I don't agree with that. That's not how you define justice and injustice. And actually, you can say that even though it's beyond people's control, it's not something that is unjust. And I'm actually going to return to that later, because I've got people who have touched on that as well, who I'm going to quote. And so this is something that I'll return to. But now I want to move on to another justification for why egalitarianism would be the default thing that you have, and why you would start with that and then maybe arrive at something else through kind of exceptions, but the default thing. So I want to take that from Rousseau, and I realized that this might be a bit French, so most people probably wouldn't subscribe to that, most egalitarians today, but it's an argument that some people make. It's an argument that Rousseau made, and it's interesting to go through because it's something different. It says that Rousseau says that the state of nature is good and civilization is bad. That's his main point. He says basically civilized people are degenerates. You know, they are these like weak people who have lost all their strength and all their resolve and everything. And so these are people who are kind of spoiled by civilization. He is the one of the creators of the noble savage myth, right? And
he wants to return to monkey. That's what he wants.
Exactly. He's taking the carrot pill, and so he has two conceptions of inequality, physical inequality and moral inequality. And he says, okay, physical inequality is that you're taller than me. Like there's differences between people. That doesn't matter too much. What he says is that moral inequality is important. And I actually want to quote from a video that Carl made in 2016, and I'm going to link below. And he says, to Rousseau, the ownership of property is the performance of inequality, and the protection of property rights is the enshrinement of inequality by the state. To Rousseau, civil society itself is the root of inequality, and it is based on property rights. The equality of the state of nature is the equality of having the bare minimum needed for survival, right? And this is Carl's paraphrasing Rousseau, so he wouldn't say it like that because he likes the state of nature, and he would say, okay, there's a lot to it that is not the bare minimum. Like, it's not a fair characterization. That's not what Rousseau would say, but that's what a reasonable person would say. So you can in this, though, you have his kind of conception of what it is. Inequality is something that is created. Moral inequality is something that is created by civilization and specifically by property rights and by protection of property rights. He says that the state is there to protect property rights, which is something that I object to, but it doesn't matter. That's his view. And so he says property rights are the basis of inequality. And if you have enforcement of property rights, that's how moral inequality is created. That's how inequality that is social rather than physical is where it comes from. And so his view would be, okay, equality is good, and equality is good because it's part of the state of nature, which you need to return to stop being a degenerate. And so that would be his view, right? So civilization bad, nature good, nature equality, civilization inequality, property rights are inequality, and therefore you need to return to non-civilization, to the state of nature, and to have equality there because that's good. And so that's why I said that it might be a bit fringe. Most people would not argue like that.
Yeah.
I know some primitivists, fun to talk to them, but that's not how most people view the world. Most people view civilization as good, and so that's why this is fringe.
I can see lots of problems here of where to draw the line, for example, between what is natural and what is civilization. For example, you could say, well, to a group of chimpanzees, they've got a society.
Yep.
Is that a civilization? Like, if human beings return to a state of nature, we're still social animals that would by necessity have to hunt with tools, for example. And if you make the tools, you'd probably have to use the tools in which you would have made to hunt. And if that's its own form of private property, and if you started taking things that other people had made, then there would be conflict, and this would be less desirable than if you just made your own tools and used them for yourself.
Yep. Yep. That's the perfect response to that, and he spends several books talking about that. So if you're interested in that, go read Rousseau. I wouldn't recommend it. Right, and so this was just kind of a segue a little bit, because this is not something that most people would argue, so it's not something good to take as a stance to criticize, because if that's strawmanning, right? And so I would like to turn to some usual approaches to how egalitarianism and equality is viewed. So this is from Sociology Group, which is a group interested in sociology. That they have a website where it's all about sociology. It's quite academic. It's a nice source to have. I'm going to link it below. Quote, "The main goal of an egalitarian society is solely the reduction of discrepancies of any sort, so that each and every social class gets an equal share of the resources, be it wealth or power. A uniform and equitable distribution of resources are emphasized. Different social groups, categorized on the basis of gender, age, status, etc., are sought to be given equal rights and benefits." So that's how they define an egalitarian society, right? They don't say it's something like this is the ideal utopia. They say, okay, if this is the definition of it. And so many people would actually say that, yes, this is a goal that you want to achieve, right? I think this is something that would be quite non-controversial to say among egalitarians. Like, this is maybe they would say, okay, there's some things that you want to not go to the extremes, but in essence, this is right. And so, of course, the assumption here is that inequality is bad, right? And so again, the question needs to be asked, why? Because I think that it's not clear that inequality is bad on its own. And I think the more sensible thing to do is to ask a follow-up question. How did the inequality that you're saying is a problem, how did that come about? Because it can come about through, I'm saying this is my opinion now, it can come about through just processes or unjust processes, through legitimate means and through illegitimate means. And so just by pointing to inequality, you can't say whether it was the one way or the other. You need to look closer at what's actually happening. And just by pointing to inequality, it tells you nothing, so it doesn't tell you whether the outcome is just or unjust. And so if that's the case, well, then inequality cannot itself be a measure of justice or injustice, right? And so that is just the kind of my view. In the same way that egalitarians assert that inequality is inherently bad, I mean, I'm saying it's morally neutral. So
yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable point, and you can almost imagine that some egalitarians may agree with you on that, in that some inequality may be inevitable, and
Yep.
therefore it's not necessarily morally bad. You know, you're going to have some variance in people's height. You don't want everyone to be uniformly the same height. Well, it doesn't really matter actually, but it would seem bizarre to you know, say, okay, well you're too tall. We're gonna try and shrink you down a little bit for some reason. It just seems unnecessary, and the actual egalitarian treatment would be far worse than the equality.
Yep.
The variance in the first place.
Yep. But so for example, Rawls would say, to your point now, that you have some inequality that is justified, but it's justified in a specific way. Equality is the default, that is good, and that is kind of something that you need to have. And you can have some inequality, but only if that inequality results in benefits to everyone, especially to the worst off. That's what he says, right? So if a specific kind of case or example of inequality benefits those worst off, well, then it's justified, right? So that's a specific way that they would say not complete equality is not always desirable. You can have justifications of inequality in some cases, but this is not this is a different discussion, right? This is not a discussion of how the inequality came about. It's a discussion about instrumentality of if inequality is practical, and if it's practical, then it can be justified. But if it's not practical, then not, right? And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, whether the inequality came about through consensual relations or through non-consensual relations. And so it could be that you have inequality that came out of consensual relations or consensual exchange of goods or money or whatever, and even if everything is undeserved, like Rawls says, if you're born with your attributes, your intelligence, your skills that you cannot really change, and it's beyond your control, then people still kind of get in kind of a commercial society where, like in a free market, people get money, specifically money, according to how useful they are to other people, right? And so like that's what money is for. It's a store of the good things that you've done for others, so that you can have them for future use if you want something good, if you want someone else to do some good things to you in exchange, right? That's what money is for. That's like it's a store of your good deeds. And so even if everything is undeserved, then people still get money according to how useful they are to society. So that inequality is not necessarily bad, even in that worst case scenario, right? Because even if that worst case scenario that Rawls says, where you agree to what Rawls says, that basically everything is undeserved, right?
I did agree with the point about free markets, although I've never heard money be described as like a sum of all your good deeds. So I mean, look at someone like Bill Gates. I mean, he's pretty rich, but
exactly.
Has he really done lots of good things?
Yes.
So
he's benefited in unimaginable ways billions of people. Like his inventions, his kind of the way that he's done things with his companies.
I'm being very pedantic here, because I'm trying to kind of separate the point of you can be a bad person, like interpersonally, and still have a lot of money.
We're not talking about his Hollywood dealings.
Yeah, but the actual, if you look at it in a purely economic sense, then what you're saying makes sense. Although I've never really heard it be characterized in such a way.
And so this is of course this is something that works in abstraction. This works in an ideal society where there's no real expropriation, or like you don't, or negligible right? If you have negligible amounts of like theft and violations of property rights, basically none, then this holds, right? Then money works that way, and this is how it is, and this is how kind of society orients itself. But then of course in today's society and in every society you have quite a lot of criminal activity, like either legitimized or not legitimized, either sporadic or systemic, and that's the other point, right? So that's the point to which egalitarians point, while saying, okay, this inequality, it's not important how it came about, because it probably came about through bad means, through illegitimate means, and not in the way of doing a lot of good to other people, for other people, but through expropriation or usurpation or something like that, right? So if you have a lot of resources just because you stole a lot of resources, well then of course that inequality between you and the victims, well, that you stole from, that is unjust. Sure. But then it becomes about who is the rightful owner of what, right? That becomes a question about property rights, and legitimate property titles to different things. And so then it becomes a question of rights protection, of property protection. And so it's not about inequality, right? It's about, like, you took something that wasn't yours. What's unjust about that is not that it's unequal between you and them. It's about you having stolen something, right? And so it's a different thing. So why are you talking about inequality if it's not relevant to the question? And so, of course, there can be systemic violations of property rights which can produce systemic unjust inequality, right? So you can, like, in my opinion, like, if you take people's money by force through taxes, for example, which they don't give you voluntarily because it's punishable, and if it was voluntary, it wouldn't need to be punishable. So if you take that by force, well, that's unjust. You can have a lot of that money. The state has a lot of that money that they took from people. Well, that's that inequality between what you or I have and what the state has. Well, that's unjust, but just because they have stolen a lot of money, not because that inequality would be bad in itself. So I still can't see, even if it's systemic like that, the problem is the violation, not the inequality. So I don't understand the point about inequality being actually the root thing that you should focus on. I don't know if you do.
Yeah,
but
I agree. I think that it quite often gets kind of snuck in, and people don't really question it that much.
Yeah.
They feel like they have to defend it in those terms, with the frame of it being equal or not, when in reality, as you're saying, it's not a matter of whether it's equal or not. It's the violation of rights in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I would now I want to move on to another overview of what equality is, what egalitarianism is, which is from Stanford Encyclopedia. I'm going to quote: "An egalitarian is one who maintains that people ought to be treated as equals, as possessing equal fundamental worth and dignity, and as equally morally considerable." So that's something that would be kind of more basic, right? So in contrast with what we've discussed so far, where you're talking about resources, and you're talking about how kind of social goods are distributed, well, now you're talking about how you approach people, the qualities that people have in and of themselves. And so then this definition, even though it seems like less contentious because of how more basic it is, it still has a lot of problems, right? So I'm going to quote again: "Controversy swirls around attempts to specify the class of beings to whom egalitarian norms apply. Some might count all and only human beings as entitled to equality of status. Some would hold that all and only persons have equal moral status, with the criteria of personhood excluding some humans from qualifying, for example, the unborn fetus or severely demented adult human, and including some non-humans, for example, intelligent beings inhabiting regions of outer space beyond Earth." Right? And so if you say, okay, all people have these basic worth and dignity and they should be treated as equals, then there's still definitional problems, like, because people exist on a continuum, you know. Like there's probably some cut-off point where you can say, okay, this is definitely a person worth of respect, person that is someone you should consider morally. But then you have a gray area where like that's not clear, right? You can have like people that are disabled to the extent where they perceive the world in some ways, but they can't really perceive themselves as doing something bad, right, or something like that. So if they can't be held morally culpable for what they do because they don't really know, they can't really imagine the consequences of what they do, well, you can't treat them equally, because that would be treating them more harshly than they deserve, based on that, based on their nature, based on what they are, based on their quality. And so that becomes kind of difficult as well. But I'm going to return to that as well later, because that's also relevant in the discussion that we're going to have in a minute.
It does seem like it takes almost an interpersonal definition of egalitarianism. It's not even politically or economically focused, almost like it's more of an approach to life than just something that is a social policy. And it does seem a bit inherently ridiculous, because you wouldn't treat like a mass murderer the same as, I don't know, a doctor who's saved lots of people's lives instead. So to say that people possess equal fundamental worth and dignity and equally morally considerable,
no, but
I mean, in that case, it'd be ridiculous to consider them.
I would say that the clause equally morally considerable would address your point of say, okay, you have equal moral standards towards those two people, and so if that person did that wrong thing, you're going to consider them worse people because they did that wrong thing than the good people.
But it's just that the baseline in which you start the consideration on is the same, and depending on how good and bad is how far it kind of goes out of that point of equilibrium, I suppose.
So I would imagine that's the idea behind it. But so I want to just briefly mention that there is this. You can have utilitarian approaches to egalitarianism, which is basically saying, okay, you need more equality than what you have naturally, because if you have like resources that people have, well, the same unit of some resource will benefit the one who has the least amount of resources because of economic laws and kind of things like that. So that's one approach to take. I don't think that goes very far. One thing is that this is an approach that is that falls under the means utilitarians and not the goals utilitarians. So it's not something that we would be talking about here, because it's just, okay, we need to reduce inequality because it leads to these good outcomes, which is the most happiness for most people, which is utilitarianism, right? And so you don't, like, that's just a means, it's not the end. And also you can't measure utility interpersonally, so like that's a non-starter. But anyway, we don't have to dwell on that, because that's only a minor footnote. So let's move on to this discussion that's going to be probably a bit more political, because we're going to be discussing how equality is used as a tactic, right? As a political weapon. And that is kind of fascinating to me, because this whole kind of political ideals discussion that we had of what is just and what is unjust and what is politically justifiable and not, well, that's all well and good, but it's not something that happens in practice. In practice, what happens is the political theater, is people using sleight of hands, they're using like tactics, they're using strategies to defeat their opponents, not in a philosophical sense, but in kind of a real way of kind of pushing them out and asserting themselves as the dominant position in politics. So it's a kind of different arena, it's a different discussion. So I find that fascinating, because it's something that you need to take way more things into account than if you just say, okay, we're going to have a purely philosophical discussion. And so in politics, egalitarianism is very useful, because you can have, as you touched on before, you can have people to whom it is a weapon to gain more power, right? That's the main reason why I would say it's used in politics, because it's something that can be an excuse for you to say, okay, there is something wrong here, and therefore I should have more power because I am the person to fix it, and therefore like that's something useful to you if your goal is more power, which is what politics is about. And so I'm going to quote from Lou Rockwell, link below as usual. He specifies that the problem with egalitarianism, with equality, is that it's not defined and it's unattainable. That's the two problems, right? And so I'm going to quote from him. What are we to understand by the word equality? The answer is, we don't really know. Its proponents make precious little effort to disclose to us precisely what they have in mind. All we know is that we'd better believe it. It is precisely this lack of clarity that makes the idea of equality so advantageous to the state. No one is entirely sure what the principle of equality commits him to, and keeping up with its ever-changing demands is more difficult still. What were two obviously different things yesterday can become precisely equal today, as you'd better believe that they are, and you'd better believe that they are equal if you don't want your reputation destroyed and your career ruined. So that's his point, right? So equality is a very useful thing to have because you never really say what it is, and you can define it in any issue between any group of people, right? So one day you can say, okay, I'm interested in whether tall and short people have equal wages, right? And then you lead a fight for that. You do your political speeches and do your reforms, and then you can turn around the other day and say, okay, now I'm not interested in that. I'm actually interested in whether tall people with white hair have higher wages than short people with brown hair. And you can say, okay, there's some discrepancy there, so that's inequality, and we need to solve that. And the way to solve that is for me to do something, and is for me to have more power and resources to reorganize the relations in society, right? And so this fungibility is something that is very useful, and this quality that the word equality has, that you can define it in any situation between any combination of characteristics that you want. And you have two of them, and it's always unequal because people are naturally different and everything is different in the world. There's endless diversity, so you never have equality. And so you can just focus on one thing and say, okay, I'm going to make this equal. And when you're done, by force, of course, when you're done, you say, okay, but now there's this thing unequal. And by the time you fix the second thing, the first thing becomes unequal again because people do unequal things. The world is diverse and endlessly so, and becomes almost like messy to the extent that you can't really fix one thing in place. So that's something that you can use all the time towards any end that you want. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, that was more or less what we were talking about earlier, wasn't it? In that it's an endless cycle, and even if they did achieve what they wanted to, perhaps in addressing another cause, the previously addressed one may be thrown out of kilter again because of the new approach to this other cause, and it just seems like an endless cycle of wasting your time, really.
Yeah, but the point is that it's not wasting your time, because what you get is the power from it. You get the opposition, right? So it's not time wasted. You waste other people's time and resources, but those are the means to your ends. So in politics, that's what it's like.
I'm accidentally attributing
I know what you meant.
goodwill to people, aren't I?
So I'm going to continue quoting from Lou Rockwell. The reason the state holds up equality as a moral ideal is precisely that it's unattainable. We may forever strive for it, but we can never reach it. What ideology could be better from the state's point of view? The state can portray itself as the indispensable agent of justice, while at the same time drawing ever more power and resources to itself over education, employment, wealth redistribution, and practically any area of social life or the economy you can name, in the course of pursuing the unattainable egalitarian program. And so that's the point that I was making just now. If something is unattainable, well, that's a blank check. It's nice, you want blank checks, especially when people believe it. If people believe that you're doing something commendable, something nice, and something just, you're striving for justice, well, then you can do whatever you want.
And of course, it's also a very good means of expanding state power as well, because you can say, look at all of these inequalities in all of these different areas. Well, the only way we can address this is by expanding the government's power over pretty much everything, and then you get to the point where you're just living under like Stalin, under communism, and everything is controlled by a bureaucrat.
And nothing is equal still.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you look at practical politics, people who engage in politics and engage in that discussion, people who are egalitarians, for example, in the Rawlsian sense, are notorious fence-sitters. And so it's funny to see that play out, have that what I just read out about the shifting definitions and about the unattainability, because then egalitarians can shift their allegiance based on what is now advantageous, right? Because it's never completely defined. And so, for example, I'm going to quote from Julian Glover, link below as well. The tough choice for the left is to understand the impossibility and undesirability of equality. The tough choice for the right is to realize that a divided and hierarchical society cannot, in the best sense of the word, be fair. And so he's being a fence-sitter, and what he's saying is, and what Rawlsians usually say, that equality of opportunity is desirable because unequal outcomes are practical. Because if you have unequal outcomes, well, people are motivated towards doing good things for society, so you want some inequality. So you want equality of opportunity just for them to have that opportunity to do something good for society. You want to have that incentive. At the same time, they say that equality of outcome is desirable because people's achievements are just the result of a genetic lottery and environmental lottery. And so if that's the case, well, you want to equalize the outcomes as well. So you can shift those positions because you value both things based on different justifications as part of one kind of whole theory, right? And so it's very politically advantageous. And there's a reason why Rawls was very venerated by politicians during his life. He was a regular guest in the Clinton White House, and so because it is politically advantageous, like his theory is something that can be used very well by politicians and by people adjacent to politics to push their goals, whatever they are, because this is such a good means of doing that. And so now we come to what might be the solution to such fence-sitting. And that is Rothbard. I'm going to quote from him as well. What he says is that you have to criticize the ideal and not the practicality. That's what I said in the beginning, right? That's what this discussion is based on. And he says that if you concede the moral ground of equality being good without question, then well, you've already lost the argument, because if you just say, okay, I agree this is good, but this is not practical, well, then they're going to come at you with another proposal that you might not be so confident in saying is impractical. Well, and in that case, they're going to win just by default, and they're going to win in that discussion, and they're going to make real what their suggestions are. So you can't do that. You can't see the moral ground. You can't say that, okay, I agree with you that this is good, even though what you suggest is evil because it's not practical, right? And so don't concede a moral ground is the moral of the story. And so I'm going to quote now. Suppose, for example, that it has come to be adopted as a universal ethical goal that all men be able to fly by flapping their arms. Let us assume that pro-flappers have generally been conceded the beauty and goodness of their goal, but have been criticized as impractical. But the result is unending social misery as society tries to continually move in the direction of arm flying, and the preachers of arm flapping make everyone's lives miserable for being either lax or sinful enough not to live up to the common ideal. The proper critique here is to challenge the ideal goal itself, to point out that the goal itself is impossible in view of the physical nature of man and the universe, and therefore to free mankind from its enslavement to an inherently impossible and hence evil goal.
That's a good little analogy there, actually. It makes it seem as absurd as it really is, in that you're trying to change immutable characteristics of human beings, even though that's impossible.
And so he continues, but this liberation could never occur so long as the anti-arm flyers continued to be solely in the realm of the practical, and to concede ethics and idealism to the high priests of arm flying. The challenge must take place at the core, at the presumed ethical superiority of a nonsensical goal. The same, I hold, is true of the egalitarian ideal, except that its social consequences are far more pernicious than an endless quest for man's flying unaided. For the condition of equality would wreak far more damage upon mankind. So he says those two scenarios are equal. Like those scenarios are the same analytically. The only difference is that egalitarianism is way more damaging, because if you actually look at the consequences of what egalitarianism proposes and what actual realized equality would do to the world, that would be much worse than this imagined scenario of flying by arm flapping.
I mean, I would like to see that actually work eventually. Yeah, that would be nice.
What, equality or arm flying?
The arm flying, of course.
I don't know, both are unattainable, so...
Yeah, I'm still not convinced by any form of kind of equality.
So, moral of the story, you cannot grant the moral high ground to any type of egalitarianism. And you can't do that because if you do, you'd be giving a blank check. And we're returning to what we said before, right? If you say, okay, equality is good, well then it can be endlessly redefined in what it is and what it's supposed to represent, and there's nothing you can do about it. That, like, you've already ceded the high ground that equality is desirable and it's a good goal. And so in political discussion, you can't do that if you want to not lose. If you can win the battle but you lose the war is the takeaway. So an example of this is that, okay, if you say, well, I believe in that basic form of equality that we mentioned 10 minutes ago about equal moral value of people, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone has basic equal human dignity, and everyone should be kind of awarded, is owed their dignity in their relations with other people. Well, then someone's going to turn around and say, well, then everyone needs state-provided internet, right, or something like that, because to have basic human dignity, it's undignified to live without an internet in these days, right? And
I would say the opposite, personally. There's a lot more dignity in being free from the internet.
There's the Rousseauan position of the carrot pill, right? And so, this is what they would do, right? And they do it all the time. I picked that example deliberately because that's what the Labour Party did last election, right? They proposed, okay, we're going to make broadband internet free, provided by the state. Well, free provided by the state, because it's undignified. It's not something like people's lives without the internet are bad or are so sad and not like worth living. So part of their bundle of goods that they need to have just by the virtue of being human is free connection to the internet, right? So,
although I was joking, I mean, to argue that the internet is something that you can't like live without, yeah. I think a lot of people would probably benefit from being on the internet less in this day and age.
No, like I agree. Like internet is obviously an amazing thing, but at the same time, you practice moderation. I
am straw manning the argument here in that access to the internet is obviously the thing that they're on about, but still.
Yeah. And so this is what they actually did, and they did it based on that consideration of basic human dignity and basic human worth, saying, okay, if you deny people free internet, because they would turn it around, right? They would say, not that I'm proposing something, is that you're denying something. That's a good political strategy. So that they would say, by denying people free access to the internet, what you do is to rob them of their human dignity, of their equal moral status that they should be afforded. And so that kind of really points to my point before, that you can't see the moral high ground, even if it comes to these kind of ideal things that you might find nice, you know. So if you liked some of it, if you like saying, okay, well, every person has the right to kind of moral dignity, or there's something special to being human, and so that thing that makes it special, well, that makes it valuable to some extent, and therefore that equal value that we have as humans, well, that's something that everyone has and that's equal. If you like something like that, rephrase it differently. something like human rights, rights protection, whatever. Don't see the moral high ground of equality being good, because then it leads to ridiculous things like that, right? Because that's where it logically leads. So how are you going to avoid that?
I've just thought of a good argument against the internet thing, in that you could say, well, was everyone in the pre-internet age, were they not human? Were they not dignified? You could say, well, they lived perfectly good lives without internet, and
so
that seems reasonable.
Yeah, but then they're gonna turn around and say, look at this troglodyte, like they're just cavemen, arguing from prehistory. Like that might be a good argument like 500 years ago. It's not a good argument now, because we live in a different world. So like it's very easy to dismiss, even though your point is valid, right?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about political strategy, it's not about whether the point is valid, it's about whether it works well.
Whether you can spin it in a good way.
Exactly.
That makes you sound good.
Exactly. And so so this was the kind of discussion of that kind of political strategy thing, and what you should do and shouldn't do because of where it leads in terms of accepting equality as good or desirable, right?
Sure.
And so let's now turn to kind of other options of how equality could be imagined, because there's some other things that you could say, okay, so far, when we've talked about equality of resources, equality of distribution of things, or maybe kind of relationship between the state and the individual, like that's all things that are kind of fine and good, but there can be also different approaches, and you can see equality in different ways. You can value it in different ways. And so one of those is a concept that is called equality of perception. And there's some people use it, most people don't use it, so I'm just gonna introduce it now a little bit to make sure that people know what it is, because it's something that is not used in common parlance. So I found a good definition of it. Equality of perception is the most basic. It dictates that for people to be equal, each person should be perceived as being of equal worth. Sure. Okay. And so, is that legit? I don't know. Let's see. So, if they should be perceived as of equal worth, right? And that's how people get to be equal. That's what equality of perception is. Well, that's like on the face of it. If you have no other specifications, though, that's not really usable, because if you have that one example that you mentioned a while ago about those two people, one who does like all good things and the other one who is a murderer, well, are they of equal worth? Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not really intuitive, right?
Yeah, it seems to me that there's also a question of equal worth to who.
Yeah.
Should it be individuals or should it be the state? Because to the state, I would agree with that. As in, well, to some extent, obviously, I don't think
they should treat equally the murderer and the hero.
Maybe not in that example. Like, obviously, there should be some limitation for criminality. That's that's a bit of a given.
No, but even criminality is like layered, right? It's shaded. There's just different extents, and so those people can't be treated equally either. Like this, I don't know.
Do you know that the point I'm trying to get at though, in that it's again looking at the equality before the law sort of thing that I'm trying to get at here, in that it should be applied equally, because people should be treated as if they were of equal worth until they do something where they perhaps prove otherwise. And this, I don't think this definition really works at an individual level, because people know that people's worth can be kind of enumerated in a number of different ways, and there's no real way of being able to establish, well, this person's worth more than that one. Like, that's also another weird way of quantifying it, in a sense.
So just as an aside, it's really weird how in English, because it's not my first language, so in English, it's really weird how you say that if someone has a sum of money, that they're worth something, they're worth that amount. What the fuck? Like, that's not a nice thing to say, Not defined by the money that you have.
I feel like I need to defend it now.
Okay, let's go.
It's more that it's just a turn of phrase. It doesn't have the implication that, you know, just because someone has more money, they are legitimately more worthwhile to the world. I think there's always been some degree of understanding that it can also be the opposite, that the person who has the most money has done the worst things to extract it. Look at someone like, I don't know, Genghis Khan, very rich at the time, but not because he was worthwhile to everyone else, because he was the worst. So it's just a shorthand way of saying something rather than an actual evaluation.
I know that it's like that. The point is that it's really like a weird linguistic term. Like, why would you characterize it like that? Like that, it has some connotations, even though I, of course, understand how it's used and what it implies.
Yeah, of course.
But that just an aside. But so that equality of perception idea is something that, if you don't specify it much more thoroughly and specify like where the boundaries are and what you think is, you know, reasonable or not, like it's not necessarily that useful, I feel. And maybe that's a reason why it's not that often used or referenced. But I wanted to give it a shot. So one option that I have is maybe it's getting at something like Lockean human rights, right? So from Stanford Encyclopedia, quote, "The Lockean view is that every person has equal basic moral rights, natural rights. Natural rights are rights that one has independently of institutional arrangements, people's subjective opinions, and cultural understandings. A person's natural rights give them a set of claims against all other persons that each person absolutely must respect." So that's kind of an overview of what Lockean's rights are. I think people probably know about them now. And so what kind of rights are those in practice? And usually it boils down to rights of association, dissociation, and exclusion. You know, like you have your own property, which is an extension of your own body and work, and therefore you have the right to control that. You have the right to kind of associate with people on their own property and disassociate from them when you want. You have the right to exclude people from your property and things like that, right? And so basic property rights are in the Lockean sense defined provisionally, not absolutely, because there is this Lockean proviso saying, well, okay, you can have property rights as long as what you claim is yours leaves equally as much and as good for others, which is a bit confusing, and people have been arguing for hundreds of years what it actually means, what he actually meant by that. But let's just say that within a Lockean framework, you have property rights to some extent and not to a full extent. Regardless, that rights protection that is kind of awarded as a right or recognized as a right that each person has, that is a good regardless of whether it's happening equally, right? And so if my property rights are protected by someone, and if they are respected by other people, well, then that's good in itself. It doesn't matter if there's another person somewhere else whose rights are not respected in the same way as mine. Like, of course it matters because that's unjust, but it doesn't make that rights enforcement net and that respect for rights that is awarded to me less valuable just because it's not happening to everyone, right? And so if equal rights protection cannot be achieved, which it cannot because that's unrealistic, it doesn't make rights protection worthless in and of itself, right? So even if it's just happening somewhere, it's still valuable. It doesn't matter if it's not equal. And so this is not, I don't see how this ties back to equality. Again, that's a similar thing to what we talked about earlier, right? With the differences between legitimately acquired wealth and illegitimately acquired wealth. The question is not about equality, it's about legitimacy, but it's about violence or expropriation, or about these types of things, about rights and not about equality. And so in a lot of different definitions of equality, Locke is featured, right, as being one of the examples of, okay, this is what equality can mean in a Lockean sense. Every person has an equal right to this and this and this. But then I don't know how convincing that is for me, at least, because those are rights irrespective of whether they are actually applying equally or not.
Yeah, I mean, that seems perfectly reasonable to me. I mean, I just find that the limitations on property rights, I don't really.
I think that's a different discussion. Let's leave it for now. We can do a different podcast on that, or a special one, because that's that's a really interesting concept, and there's a lot of people that spend a lot of time on it, and so I want to give it justice. And so let's move on to another kind of option of what equality could be, which is maybe something like political equality. So which is not like I'm not taking now concepts from any one thinker. I'm just saying, okay, this is what usually people see as valuable, and let's look at that, right? And so political equality, okay, everyone has the right to vote, and their votes are of equal weight, and so that is something that's seen as good. Why? I don't know. You've got that idea that from Starship Troopers, service guarantees citizenship, that a lot of our listeners will be familiar with, and that goes against that, right? That is something that says, okay, it's something that you need to deserve. It's something that you need to work towards, and that is a reward for some effort that you put in. And so, if people are fans of that, well, then they're against political equality of the vote, right? And so they have to reconcile those two positions. Well, even beyond that, we can say, okay, well, the state is essentially what it is a huge insurance company that has a monopoly on a lot of things, and that's its basic business model. And on the side, it does a lot of other business, like that it can do whatever for PR reasons or real reasons, whatever. But that's the basis of it. No, it's a business. It's a company, and it can be led in different ways, right? It's led by managers that are selected in different ways than managers in usual companies. They are selected by votes, but the votes are kind of by the customers of the business and not by the employees of the business or even the board of the business. So it works in a bit of a different way. And so if that's what the state is, well, then it can be managed well and can be managed badly, whatever its finances, everyone's in debt all the time, all the states. And so, but not just that, like even management, to make policies where people will be happy with them, right? That all takes skill, because then you have protests, you have social conflicts and everything. So it takes skill, it takes a lot of experience, it takes like brilliant people to come up with something that is worth having as policies, as what the state is going to do. And so if there's expertise that's needed, well, not everyone's skills are the same, so like why should everyone be as qualified to choose those managers, right, of that company that is the state? Well, if you need some specific expertise, some people know much more about what it takes to create good policies in this area and that area. Some people don't, and so people have different skills, interests, and qualities, and not everyone is required to be interested the same. No, but everyone should be, because like why should be, right? Interested in the same things and know the same amount of things about politics, because people's personal lives are more important than politics to most people, which is the right thing to do. I can understand. And so why would you want people who stay away from it most of the time to actually be the ones that determine who the most qualified person like for being the manager of the company is, right? I know. And so then that means that everyone is differently qualified to vote in that way.
Yeah. Right? To kind of play devil's advocate in that position, you could say that everyone is a relative expert on their own life, and as long as they understand the implications of what they are voting for, which I know is one of those things where it may not happen that often or not, who knows. It's always difficult to say because everyone has a different standard, but I think the notion that voters aren't necessarily cognizant of the differences between candidates to an extent where it limits the process of democracy can be, it sometimes can be overstated, although I certainly think it applies more in certain states than others and certain areas than others, and it's a very nuanced and varied thing.
So I'm not even arguing that like
I'm not putting words in your mouth.
No,
by
no,
the
no,
way.
no. I'm not now even arguing that like some people shouldn't vote because they can't tell the difference between candidates. Like that's nothing like that. I'm just asking a question like, why should everyone be treated as if they're equally qualified to pick some managers of some company, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're obviously not. Like, people are not equal. People are infinitely diverse in their lives and in their interests and their skills and everything. And so, why would they be treated as if that's not the case? Like, I don't know. It just seems counterintuitive to me. It doesn't mean that someone that you should say, okay, this person like shouldn't vote because X. You know, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, okay, this is an unreasonable approach.
Sure. Obviously, there are inequalities in every area that are kind of irreconcilable, even.
And so another factor within this discussion is that people have a different relation to the state that they live under, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people are net tax recipients, so maybe they live on welfare more than they pay in taxes, or they might be getting some subsidies more than they pay in taxes. It's hard to determine most of the time. Or some people can be state employees, right? They pay no taxes at all. They're just completely tax net recipients, and so those people have a conflict of interest, right? Like, in every other case, apart from the state, you would recognize that as a conflict of interest. So you would kind of make a barrier between those people and the influence that they can have in their company, because their influence is going to be detrimental.
Sure.
You know? So why not? Why is that not being considered in polite discussion in politics? Like, this is a real issue and it's a problem, and it like. Can we all agree on politics being a bit like not in a great spot?
Only taxpayers can vote is what I'm hearing here.
And so you can people also differ in the amount of tax paid, right? And so some people pay very little in taxes, some people pay a lot in taxes, and so those have the same though the votes of those people have the same weight as well as those who are net tax recipients. Well, then also you have people who are property owners in the country where the state/company kind of manages, and then you have temporary states that don't own any property, and then don't have those same stakes. So that's another thing, right? So there's loads of these different things which kind of hint at this approach of like equal weighted votes not being the best, because like it doesn't sound very reasonable. You know, it sounds like something's like someone made it up while they were pretending that people are equal and that everything is equal, and this whole thing like is something that just been taken for granted.
I think it's just the Greeks didn't have varying degrees of pottery shards. That's the problem. Oh, no. It all stems from that.
Yeah, but like it's I don't think it comes down to the Greeks, because it's very
joking.
I know, but after the Greeks, you had a lot of time where like voting wasn't in the same sense that we would consider now. It was not something that would be considered. And so the final thing about it is to consider is that the franchise is not equal now. You have prisoners, you have children, you have mentally challenged people. Those can't vote. Why not? If everyone has the right to an equal vote, why not? Well, then you say, okay, these people are not qualified to vote based on these things. Oh, but qualified, you know? Why aren't those other things that make them qualified and unqualified considered in a similar way? I don't know. That's not a question for me. That's a question for proponents of what we have now. So that's just some questions to ponder. And so just move on to the kind of last thing that I wanted to briefly touch upon, which is equal rights. Just equal rights vis-a-vis the state. So the thing that we touched on first in this podcast, which was, okay, the state should treat everyone equally. Well, why? Brits don't have the same rights as Belgians. Yeah. Everyone has different rights.
We have more, that's why.
So in different parts of the world, in different countries, people have different rights, right? And so different rights vis-a-vis their states. And so why should be equal rights be something that is desirable? Because if that is something that the people want locally, there's something else that you want here, some other rights protection, well, then you force them to do something else. Well, you can say, okay, those are different countries, but then the response is, well, those borders are kind of arbitrary. A lot of borders are arbitrary. Some borders are quite well ethnically aligned or culturally aligned, and a lot of borders aren't. So you can have the same culture within different borders, or different cultures within the same borders, and so borders don't work like that in practice. And so you can't just say, okay, the current status quo of whose rights should be equal and whose rights shouldn't be equal is valid, because it's obviously not valid, it's arbitrary. And so, yeah, same thing with cultures, right? So different countries, different cultures, different ethnicities, those kind of correlate with borders somewhat, but not completely. And so what can you do then, like philosophically?
You could even use the example of, depending on who you ask, someone might say, well, for the area of the Crimea, it should be the Russians' rights that should apply to them, whereas another person may say, oh, actually, it should be the Ukrainians, because that land actually belongs to one or the other, and where it's disputed, it kind of is irreconcilable in a kind of rights perspective.
And it's irreconcilable because it's inherently collectivistic like that, right? Because if you advocate for equal rights, in the sense that we talked about, you advocate for a world state. Like, there's no avoiding it. Because if you want to have equal rights vis-a-vis the state as everyone else in your country, well, then those arbitrary borders between your country and other country that don't necessarily reflect ethnicities or cultures or anything like that, like those are not justified in the same way. So you would have to say, okay, I want them to have the same rights vis-a-vis the state as I do. And so what you end up ultimately is a world state, which is something that is an interesting conclusion, because people who would advocate for equal rights before the state would usually not advocate for a world state. So those have to solve that question.
The globalists, what are you on about? I mean, they're always advocating for this sort of thing.
And so what it comes down to is that if you reject the conclusion of the world state, well, you have to advocate for particular rights and not for equal rights. And you advocate for protection and provision of certain kind of goods and rights that you have, some kind of relation that you have with the state or with any other insurance company that's around. And so that goes down to the individual. So an individual only an individual can define what rights they value and what kind of they value in the relationship with others and with insurance companies and the state, which is another one as well, right? And so this is all just down to what the individual prefers and what rights they would like to have protected and what they wouldn't. And in fact, they can consider a lot of protection of rights actually an intrusion into their rights. It all just depends on what they prefer and what they don't. And so if it goes down to the individuals, well, then the reverse, the equal rights point of view, well, then that applies to groups. So it goes to things like globalism, communism, or nationalism, like these types of things. That's where we end up. And so that's not something that I think would be worth it or would be worth considering. And that's why I don't really like this talk of equal rights, because I consider myself an intellectual defender of human rights, first and foremost, and by claiming that you're going to make the rights equal, well, you're not going to make them equal. That's the first thing, and the other thing is it's not desirable, because you're forcing people into something that they don't want. You're creating forced association, and so you're violating people's rights by claiming that you protect them. And so that's not actually what should be happening, I think.
That's what the mafia does, isn't it?
Exactly.
Like we're protecting you, but also give us some money.
Exactly. And so that equality of these rights becomes another hammer that can be wielded by the powers that be to say, okay, I'm going to do X or Y against you, against your will, because you deserve this protection that you don't want. And so because people want different things, they want different rights protected. You can't have equality without trampling on their rights instead. And so just towards the end, I wanted to quote Rothbard again, who also discusses the historical kind of view of where the discussion of equality lies and what the weird thing about it is. So, quote, "The current veneration of equality is, indeed, a very recent notion in the history of human thought. Among philosophers or prominent thinkers, the idea scarcely existed before the mid-18th century. If mentioned, it was only as the object of horror or ridicule. The profoundly anti-human and violently coercive nature of egalitarianism was made clear in the influential classical myth of Procrustes, who forced passing travelers to lie down on a bed, and, if they were too long for the bed, he lopped off those parts of their bodies which protruded, while racking out the legs of the ones who were too short." And so he sees equality like that. And the particular kind of interesting section of that quote is what I want to give you as a parting thought of sorts, is that the uniform acceptance of equality as a noble goal is very recent, as something that is just not discussed because it's taken as granted. So that shouldn't get lost in the discussion where we debate whether equality is legit or not and whether it's a good goal. That's not. While we debate that, we should also consider that this is a discussion that is really weird to have historically, because historically it would be absurd to have discussion to defend equality in the first place. And so we have to recognize that this is really weird, what the intellectual moment is in history that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I mean, it's one of those things where if you read really old literature, there's no mention of this sort of thing. It's just accepted that they almost just refer to people almost by their caste, in peasant or noble or stuff like that. They don't see any kind of separation legally. The opposite even. That's they see the obvious separation between these groups, and it's almost completely accepted and not questioned. And I think our language now is, because of seeing people not as these groups of people who have these shared innate characteristics, but of course all equal under the law sort of thing, where that makes the language of equality seem more reasonable and viable. And do you get the point I'm making here?
No, I do. And I just wanted to add that if you look at history and how people were approached in maybe the caste language like that, well, just because historically people used to be approached like that in a non-egalitarian way, doesn't mean that all versions of non-egalitarian approach need to be caste based or anything like that. That's a historical kind of quirk that they used to be there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a part of the discussion going forward or today about egalitarianism or non-egalitarianism.
The key thing there is that they wanted these groups to be stagnant and not much in the way of mobility, but I think we would both agree that social mobility and people rising because of their own merits is a good thing.
That's crucial.
Exactly. And that's the difference there, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so I really like this, and if you like this as well, all the links are going to be below that if you want to read on it more or watch the stuff that I've watched in preparation for this. So it's all going to be in the notes below in the reading list, and so I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you very much for watching, and make sure to check out all of our stuff on the website. And of course, as I said at the start, Contemplations is now going to be just on the Saturday, but it's going to be longer, more in-depth, more detailed, and better.
And on Sundays you will have epochs.
That too.
Right. Thank you for watching.
Goodbye.